Power is a difficult concept to define and understand. Philosophers have debated the nature of power for centuries, and we still don't have a clear, agreed-upon definition. Because the use of power can be seen at all levels of human interactions, from interpersonal dynamics to the diplomacy of nation-states, there is little agreement on many basic questions about the subject, such as, what is power? How is power acquired? When is power used ethically? Now, few will argue that power has fascinated the minds of great thinkers from a wide range of disciplines, and perhaps it is because of this nearly universal appeal to so many scholars that we have a wide variety of methodological rigor, definitional specificity, and practical scope. This jumbled mix of purpose and scale makes focused conversations about power very cumbersome. So let's concentrate on what's relevant. We are interested in how all of those perspectives translate to managerial efficiency and leadership effectiveness inside of the organizational setting. And for that reason, our study of power use incorporates both analyses of control over corporate resources and the personal characteristics of people who regularly use power in the workplace. There is no easy definition for power. Power is a complex social phenomenon with many different dimensions. It is all part of the intricacies of human relationships. It is fundamental to our way of life. It is necessary for well-organized interactions. Power is more than a tool used by members of an organization. Power is the glue that keeps the organization together. And one of the best ways to understand a complex topic is to understand the context of its application. Let's get to work.
Navigating business politics, mapping your path to power. You're listening to the Durable Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, John Lamb.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Durable Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, John Lamb. It's good to have you with us. Today, I want to talk about a broader context, a broader perspective on the topic that I have been bringing to you guys for a long time now. That is power and politics in the organizational setting. Now, power continues to be a difficult subject for us to wrap our minds around. Different disciplinary focuses have helped, but they've all left us with as much confusion as they've added insight into the conversation. Now, there have been many studies that have dived into the topic. Some have been very effective and some not so much. As an academic, as someone who has read a lot of peer-reviewed papers about this topic, I can tell you that there are individuals out there in the field that write really good papers on the topic and others not so much. Okay, but I want to share with you the general ideas of what these scholars are bringing to the table. Relatively few among them have helped to actually clarify the elements of power, what its sources are, and what its constituent parts are that make up this nebulous concept that we all call power. Now, this work has added insight into the specific dimensions of power, but it still hasn't given us a clarity on the central essence of what power is. Now, for sure, most of the work adds to the ambiguity rather than diminishing the ambiguity. Now, let me say this in summary. The research directions on the operational uses of power, they all point to this variety and breadth of the entire scope of the topic in general. We can take a look at conversations from sociologists to political scientists, and these individuals have added a ton to the topic of power. Philosophers and even historians have contributed a great deal to this conversation. Many writers have defined power in various ways as a potential for social interaction. Some call it a predictor and a conditioner of general human behavior. And some have described power as an ethical element of this broader concept that we call freedom. Some call it a tool for analysis of the thing we call influence between two individuals. And some see power as a basis for control, specifically by use of violence. All this may be very true in particular perspectives. Some see power as a possession in a zero-sum game. It's a commodity to these individuals who study power from that perspective. Because they see it as a shareable or shared commodity, this means that that particular resource can be monopolized. And others view power as a general capacity for personality. This means that these individuals see this perspective in a way that is innate. It's inside the person. You either are born with power, meaning the personality required to execute on the power, or you're not. That's one way of looking at it. Individually, all of these different dimensions add to the complexity of this social phenomenon. Together, they don't really give us a whole lot of clarity. More or less, they kind of jumble up the perspectives and create a lot more confusion than actual clarity. Now, many specific definitions that I've just illustrated to you, they overlap, or some even contradict each other. That's why it's very hard to talk about this topic. The opinions on the topic of power go all the way back to antiquity. Thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, other philosophers have contributed an enormous amount to the subject. Now, one name that you may associate with the concept of power is Machiavelli. This person contributed an enormous amount to power theory and the actual practical application of power, but you may view his name, Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, in a negative light. You may see him or his name associated with devious machinations, underhanded maneuvers to control perspectives and narratives and situations, all for the sake of obtaining more power. That is one perspective of power. I don't want to dismiss that. For those of you who believe that power is always negative, to be sure, that is a perspective that we can adopt. But is it always that way? That's what I want to challenge. This nature of power is ingrained in all of us. It's part of human nature. It's part of the essence of the human condition, the human experience. The essential nature of power, because of all of these different perspectives, still has eluded us. Its dimensions of power, the dimensions of power and how to analyze it can be troublesome when we look at it from one perspective, but not so troublesome and even helpful when we look at it from another dimension. Its meaning and actual application is practically challenging for some to actually put into use. I can go to Barnes & Noble right now. Yeah. Barnes & Noble still exists, right? Many other bookstores have gone the way of the dinosaur, but Barnes & Noble, by and large, I think still exists. I can go on the Barnes & Noble, go to the leadership section, find, if I can, a book on power, and it will give you some general theories, but how to actually apply it, how to actually use what's in the book to accumulate more power, specifically, as we are concerned, inside of the organizational setting, that can be very difficult. So the practical application can be enigmatic, to say the least. The regular use of power, whether that is in normal settings or in crisis operations, that can sometimes seem warranted and at other times seem ethically dubious. You see, what I'm trying to say is there's few other social concepts that are confusing and troublesome. One great thinker, St. Augustine, gives us this quote about a completely different subject, but we can see its analogies when we are having a conversation about power. What he said about time is very apt to our study of power. He said, we all know perfectly well what it is until someone asks us. If I ask you, person on the street, what is power? I think you know intuitively. You have a gut feeling for what it is. But if I ask you to explain it without giving you the opportunity to write me a 10-page essay, you're going to have a difficult time consolidating your thoughts into a quick soundbite, right? If I just shove a mic in your face as a man on the street. The idea of power use, specifically as we were talking about in the organizational setting, is very strong ethical undertones. It has very deep implications and ties to the study of business ethics. To be frank with you and honest with you, I didn't understand the necessity for my courses in business ethics as I was going through business school. I thought it was something that I can just slough off, as ethics is something we all have an intuition about. Just do what's right. But it wasn't until I got into the study of power and politics inside of the organizational setting that I found it to be enormously consequential, because when it gets down to the broader decisions that senior executives make, decisions about moving into a new market and spreading resources thin and risking organizational resources, putting all of that at risk in light of potential failure. Should you or should you not do that? That is an ethical question, after all, because if you do, what are you prioritizing? Potential profits over possible layoffs for individuals when it does come time to make decisions about layoffs, to downsize the organization? What are you prioritizing? Are you prioritizing shareholder wealth over the livelihood of individuals inside of the organization? Recently, Elon Musk was written about in the news, as he is often apt to be written about. The most recent headline is that Elon Musk sent out this email saying that he wants to see his senior managers and executives in the office at a minimum or no less than 40 hours a week. In other words, he's saying the hybrid lifestyle or the work from home lifestyle is gone for Tesla. This is enormously consequential because what he is saying has ripple effects in workplaces in general, because he's a very influential voice, right? Is that an ethical decision? I don't know. We can have a conversation about that. These decisions made by individuals who hold enormous power inside of these large organizations cannot be easily dismissed. Power is inextricably linked to the topic of business ethics. So I was wrong. I fully admit I was fully wrong to minimize the importance of my business ethics classes. I did pretty well in that class. I don't want you to have this misconception that I did poorly in that class. I got an A in that class, but at the time it just wasn't very important to me until like I said, until I started studying power in greater depth. Power is a part of organizational life, undisputable from my perspective. Someone else may have a different point of view. I will argue with that person until I'm blue in the face. I have my perspective, and I believe it is the right one. Power is an indispensable, inignorable, is that a word? Unignorable part of organizational life. People are always interacting inside of our organizations in their respective groups to secure resources to obtain the goals that they've been given, to achieve the objectives that have been set out for them, to achieve desired results for themselves and for the organization at large. All interactive communication inside of that setting has a purpose. Now, we may ignore or dismiss some of those communications, the water cooler talk, as trivial. But if we look into the interactions of those who are politically savvy, we can see that every single interaction has intention, even the trivial ones, even the smaller conversations that are around the water cooler. We can get into that conversation on another day. Just know that these perspectives on every single communication being purposeful and full of intention inside of the office is a part of the power dynamics, the political dynamics. So because everyone is trying to achieve his or her purpose in every communication, in every interaction in the organization, these individuals, by our definition, are engaging in power activities. Because of this ambiguity of power in organizational life, everything that we just talked about, it's really not hard to understand that there are multiple perspectives and definitions of power. But let me give you this perspective. Power is an incredibly difficult concept to understand. Granted, right? I think I hammer that point home. But mostly because it is so ambiguous, it's so nebulous. And the best way to understand an extremely nebulous concept, something that's very hard for us to wrap our minds around, the best way to understand all of that is to understand the context, the boundaries of when power is in play and when it is not in play, the boundaries of its application, the context of its application. And in this podcast, hopefully what I want to do is give you some more context of when it is used, how it's used, why it's used, and when it's not used, why it's not used, how it's not used. I want to give you a different way of looking at it, not by defining power itself, but by defining more of its boundaries. Okay? As we continue this conversation on this podcast, that's really all that I'm going to be doing. This episode is about setting that foundation. We're talking about power, not by talking about power itself. In every conversation that we will have going forward, we will be talking about power by talking about its boundaries, its context. It's a difficult concept, to be sure. It's a difficult concept to learn. Let me take a water break here. Now, those who are concerned with the differences between power and its synonyms, such as authority or control or influence or domination, those who are concerned about that, they use those terms, interchangeably. They have one point of view on the concept of power when you use those terms interchangeably. There are still others who make enormous efforts to draw distinctions between those concepts. The differences between power and authority, the differences between power and influence, the differences between power and control. Just because one author says those terms are interchangeable doesn't mean that we have to see them as interchangeable. We can create nuance in our definitions. And in some cases, again, because the power is so nebulous, it may be helpful to see those terms as interchangeable. We must use these terms very skillfully in our discussions, because when we don't, there's very little value in the words that we're using. We must use these words very carefully when we compare the different perspectives on power. We need a definition of power that is broader, gives us freedom and latitude to explore. And that's why I want to discuss context. And this kind of definition that we want to create for ourselves, for our use in this in ongoing conversations about power and politics in the organization, this kind of definition is going to enable us and open doors for us, give us opportunities to analyze the personal applications of power. Examples of power inside of relationships, such as the differences between if you have two bosses and you work in a matrix kind of setting. Most engineering and architectural and design firms have a matrix kind of setting. If you work in that kind of setting, then you've got two or three or multiple bosses. Who do you give more priorities to in directions that are given from these bosses? These kind of personal decisions that we make or that others make for us are enormously important when we use these terms interchangeably or not. What we need in our study is to incorporate the analyses of people with power and their control over organizational resources. And then we have to also understand the personality traits, the characteristics of those people who understand or who use the power. And there's little agreement about what power is, okay? We've already established that. Where and when an individual gets it, there's little agreement about how it is used. But what is clear is that power is pervasive and it's everywhere in the organization. It's central to the success and functioning of the organizational setting. What we experience in our organizational life, like it or not, are the effects of power. The decisions and policies that are set by possibly executives who have left the firm, who have retired or have gone on to other positions at other companies. Decisions and policies that they made may be a part of our lives today. Workflows that they've set, interactions that are established norms between one department and another. These are the effects of power that stay with the organization long after the individuals have left the organization, in some cases. In those cases, though, the way to change those things takes enormous amounts of power to change those cultural norms and expectations. Again, it is another application of power in the organizational setting. Now, perhaps the most significant area that power is seen is in higher executive decision making. Because in these areas, as I have consulted with many organizations and individuals at that level, at these levels, what we're doing is making decisions on very ambiguous, nebulous, uncertain outcomes about the future. We're trying to prognosticate something that we don't have certainty about. Now, we can dump a ton of analyses into our decision making and build out models that will show us what life would be like if we go down option A versus option B. Great organizations have armies of analysts and economists and big thinkers to create models that can give guidance to sets of decisions, menus of options. That doesn't mean they know it for sure. The best ones will only give you a probability of success. Now, because what they're trying to do is uncertain, at the same time, the different options require resources to execute on. And resources, as we all know, are finite. We don't live in a universe where resources are infinite. Sorry, this is just the reality of living in this universe. Resources are finite, and we have to execute on a particular path with the constraints of finite resources and limited time. That is why the higher up in the organization you go in your leadership progression, the more political dynamics you will experience, the more challenging the political landscape will become. And you have to navigate all of that with care and with intention. Otherwise, sorry to say, you're going to get kicked to the curb and left on the sidelines. Moving up in the organization means power and politics becomes all the more vital. It doesn't mean, I can already hear some of you saying, it doesn't mean that you have to be nefarious about it. It doesn't mean you have to be self-interested about it. It doesn't mean you have to be dark and manipulative about it. It just means you have to understand it and understand its use. The consequences are enormous. Let me give you an example of power and politics inside of an organizational setting gone wrong, such that consequences are actually lethal. Let's go back to the year 2019, just a few years ago, when Boeing was making decisions about the 737 MAX. This plane was getting rolled out quickly. Why? Because particular individuals inside of Boeing were worried about losing market share to the new Airbus plane. One of the big customers of Boeing, American Airlines, already placed a big order with Airbus, and they were threatening to move away from Boeing. So Boeing said, hang on, we can get you that 737 MAX quickly. So they rolled it out, dismissing all kinds of checks, ignoring all kinds of safety protocols written by and examined by the FAA. So the FAA, congressional hearings did show that the FAA was somewhat complicit in the disasters that unfolded. They rolled out this new plane, ignoring all of these safety protocols for the purpose of obtaining or retaining their market share against Airbus. Were there individuals and engineers inside of the Boeing Corporation that said, stop, we're not ready to go live with this yet? Yes, of course there were. But why was it that the desires and wishes of certain executives to move into the market quickly was more than enough, overpowered the desires and wishes of particular individuals, certain engineers and certain departments who said, no, we're not ready yet? Why? Because of power. Those individuals had power, the other ones did not. The consequences of not obtaining power when you need it means your organization can possibly roll out a product that can cost lives. So, I've said this before, when you have a vision for the future of your organization that you believe to be right, it is your responsibility to get the power necessary to make that vision a reality. You can't wait for your correct, right, meritorious, is that a word? Meritorious decision to come to light. You can't wait for everyone else to see things your way, because that may or may not happen. What you need to make things happen quickly and urgently is to play politics, get power, to make your vision a reality. That's what it means to have power. That's what it means to have the responsibility of leadership. The higher up you go in the organization, the more power is required. Power defies a succinct definition. We can't do it. All of those little illustrations that I just gave you, try to consolidate that into a 30-second soundbite. It is not possible. If you are able to do that, I'll call you a poet, but not necessarily an academic, scholar, a consultant, or a practitioner of the topic. You may be very skillful with words, but you will inevitably leave out and ignore enormous parts of the concept. Power no matter how you try to squeeze it into a box for a nice little neat definition, will find a way to bust out. The topic itself will find a way to bust out of that box. It's a term that is associated with many other synonyms, but it has one universal idea, and that is power is used for the purpose of controlling others. They may be aware of your use of power, or they may not be. The control may be punitive, it may be coercive, or it may be mutually beneficial. Nevertheless, it is the act of one person or group controlling another person or group. Power is not one-to-one. Sometimes it's one-to-many. Sometimes it's many-to-one. Nevertheless, it is about individuals trying to control other individuals. That's a lot for today. I think I've given you some more context on power for this first foundational conversation in this podcast. What I want to do in the next episode is talk about particular characteristics of power to give you more context, what it means in particular situations, how scholars and academics study and measure the use of power or the absence of power, what it means for a person to be dependent or independent from others who have power. All of these different characteristics are more context for you to understand what power is and what it is not. But for now, let me leave you with that. Power is something that we all need. It's more than just a tool that some use inside of the organization. It is the very glue that holds the organization together. So with that concept, that's the context that I want to leave you with today. But let me ask you this. How have you seen power used in your organization? Has it been ethical use? Has it been unethical use? How have you used power? What tools and tricks have you used to obtain more power or retain and protect your power? Let's have an ongoing conversation about it. If you are in a sticky situation, a sticky political situation inside of your workplace that you need maybe a second set of eyes and ears to give you some additional advice or input on, some coaching on, reach out to me. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with you to see how I can help. But for now, I'm John Lamb. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. This has been the Durable Leadership Podcast. Take care.